Welcome back to Success Beyond Borders from Ngulum.
Yeah.
Every week we try to take a deep dive into some topic
Yeah.
that's really relevant if you're in those, fast-paced media and tech worlds.
Right.
And this week I think we've got one that's going to really kind of get you thinking.
Definitely.
We're calling it the SaaS Paradox. And
Yeah.
it might sound a bit counterintuitive, but the idea here is that in software as a service,
Yeah.
sometimes trying to appeal to everyone might actually be what's holding you back.
It really is. It kind of flies in the face of what we think we're supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like more is always better, more customers is always better, but that's not always the case.
And so for this deep dive, we've been, going pretty deep into some Ungulum insights.
Yes.
Specifically, there's a great article called The SaaS Paradox, Why More Might Actually Be Less in the Quest for Growth.
It's a really fascinating article, and it makes you think about customer acquisition in a completely different way.
It does. And, for those of you listening in,
Yeah.
you're probably, trying to figure out how to, make your business grow, how to make your company grow in these industries.
Yeah.
So here's the question we really want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we go through this.
Yeah.
Are you trying to cast like the widest net possible? Just get anybody and everybody.
Shotgun approach.
Yeah, exactly. Or are you, a little bit more sniper-like in your focus?
Right.
Trying to be very targeted, very specific about who you're going after.
Right.
That's what this deep dive is really all about.
Right. And the article starts off with this really, really great image, which is the allegory of the two ships.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe you could kind of walk us through that.
Yeah. So picture it. You've got these two ships,
Yeah.
and they're heading out on this vast ocean.
Right.
Big, wide open sea.
Right.
And they're both looking for, like, this far offshore.
Yeah.
This shore that's, supposedly just, like, full of treasure.
Right.
Now, the first ship, their whole thing is they want the most direct route possible.
Straightforward.
Straight shot, yeah.
Yeah.
And they've got this super diverse crew.
Yeah.
Like, all jack of all trades kind of folks.
Right. Right.
Ready for anything, whatever comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Their thinking is the more general our capabilities, the better we can adapt.
Right.
Be
Yeah.
ready for anything.
Whatever happens out there.
Yeah.
Now, the second ship, total opposite.
Interesting.
Totally different approach. They've decided we're going to split our resources.
Okay.
We're going to have two very specific sets of charts.
Okay.
Two very specific, highly specialized teams.
Got it.
One team's experts in those like deep shipping lanes.
Yeah.
The ones, the big cargo vessels use, the well-established routes.
Mhm. And then the other team is all about those, like, shallower, more unpredictable coastal waters.
Okay.
So very, very different skill sets, very different strategies. Now, both ships, same goal.
Yeah.
Reach that shore, grow their fortunes,
Right.
get all that treasure. But how they're going to do it, totally different.
Totally different approaches.
One's a little more diversified,
Mhm.
one's a little more specialized.
Yeah.
And so that's the starting image here.
And the article is quick to point out this isn't, actually about ships and oceans.
Right.
This is about sauce.
Yeah.
So the vast ocean is the customer landscape, right? And
Yeah.
the journey.
Yeah.
The journey to the treasure, that's your quest for growth and profitability.
Yeah. And for a long time in SaaS, conventional wisdom has been just go after everybody.
Yeah.
More customers, more potential revenue, right?
Right.
Seems simple enough. But that's where this whole paradox comes in.
That's where it gets tricky.
Yeah. The article's asking, could this broad approach, trying to be everything to everyone, could that actually be what's holding you back?
That's a good question.
And the article really gets into this by, showing the kind of key difference between enterprise clients.
Right.
Those big, more complicated organizations.
Yeah.
And then your SMBs,
Right.
your small and medium-sized businesses.
So it's essentially different sizes of customers.
Yeah, but it's not even just size. It's like they're almost different species,
Different species. I like that.
different habitats, different playbooks for how you got to sell to them, how you got to market.
That's interesting. So tell me about those big enterprise clients. What are some of the things that make them tick?
So the big thing about enterprise clients, the article says, is that they are complex.
Okay.
They have like these really complicated organizational structures.
Makes sense.
Their needs can be like super specific.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the procurement process.
Right.
which is notoriously slow.
So many hoops to jump through.
Multiple stakeholders.
Yeah.
Layers of approval.
Right.
Long evaluations. And then, they're laser focused on ROI.
Of course.
They want to know that they're going to get, like, tangible value from the software.
Bottom line. Yeah.
And then how is this going to integrate with what they already have?
Right.
Which a lot of times is like these legacy systems.
Mm.
That's a whole thing.
Security, compliance, all that good stuff.
Huge, especially in media, right?
Of course.
Where, protecting content is just like the biggest thing.
Absolutely. Now, what about the SMBs? What are their priorities?
So SMBs, much faster pace.
Okay.
They want things that are easy to use.
So intuitive design is really important.
Huge, because they need software that doesn't require tons of training.
Mm-hmm.
They want to onboard quick.
Got it.
They want to be up and running and seeing results fast.
Makes sense. They don't have time to waste.
Exactly. And of course, pricing has to be super clear.
Right.
Straightforward and affordable.
Absolutely.
And they don't usually have those like crazy integration needs.
Right. They're not dealing with legacy systems.
No, and their vetting cycles are much, much shorter.
So it's about solving a problem, solving it quickly, and solving it affordably.
Exactly. It's like very immediate needs, and they're very, very focused on being efficient.
So we've got these two very different types of customers, and the article then goes on to look at some real-world examples of SaaS companies.
Right.
Companies that have really found success by sort of focusing their efforts. So tell me about some of those companies and what they're doing that's working.
Yeah, let's start with Slack.
Okay, yeah. Great example.
So Slack, famously used this product-led growth strategy.
Right.
Their platform is really user-friendly,
Easy to use.
and they built this great sense of community,
Yeah.
around their product.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the freemium model.
Right.
So small teams can try it, see how it works, get hooked,
Yep.
and then organically it starts to spread within those larger organizations.
Interesting. So it's like a bottom-up approach.
Totally, yeah.
As opposed to going through the top brass.
Yeah. So, instead of trying to convince the CEO, you get the employees using it,
Clever.
and then they kind of spread it from there.
That's a really interesting approach. What's another example of a company that's done well by focusing?
How about Zoom?
Zoom. Yeah.
I mean, they were all about creating this incredibly easy to use, like seamless video conferencing experience.
Right.
Yeah, it appealed to everyone, really.
Mm-hmm.
Big companies, small companies, but especially those smaller teams,
Yeah.
who maybe didn't have the budget or the time for like extensive training.
Mm-hmm.
It just worked right out of the box.
Right. It was just so easy.
Super accessible.
Now, what about a company that took a more enterprise-focused approach?
Yeah, well, Workday is a good example of that.
Workday. Okay.
They were targeting enterprise from the start.
Right. From the get-go.
And they did it through really, really deep, very complex integrations
Okay.
with existing systems.
So really meeting the specific needs of those large organizations?
Yeah, and then they provided like incredible support.
Okay.
Very specialized, very robust. And they had these very, very carefully planned, long account management cycles.
So they were playing the long game.
Very much so, yeah.
Interesting. Now, their article also mentions a few other companies, right?
It does, yeah.
Like Loom, Notion, Tableau. What did you notice about those companies?
So with Loom, Notion, Tableau, it seemed like their success really came from figuring out exactly who their ideal user was.
Mm-hmm.
Loom, it was those individuals
Right.
within larger companies
Yeah.
who needed like better communication tools, better asynchronous communication.
Makes sense.
It was this broader mix.
Okay.
Individuals, small teams
Yeah.
who wanted a simpler, more intuitive way to organize their work.
Mm-hmm.
And then Tableau, it was really focused on those data analysts who needed super powerful visualization tools.
So they were all about solving a specific problem for a specific group of people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, the article even cites some industry data
Yeah.
that supports this whole idea.
Oh, really? What kind of data?
So they found that, different types of buyers,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's enterprise or small businesses,
Yeah.
they have significantly different sales cycles.
Okay.
They have different price sensitivities.
Right.
And their adoption patterns for new tech are different.
Makes sense.
So a one-size-fits-all approach
Yeah.
might sound good in theory,
Right.
but it often ignores these really important, like, subtle differences.
Nuances.
Yeah. And that could really mess up your growth strategy.
So what are the downsides? What are the pitfalls of trying to be everything to everyone?
Well, one of the big ones is that, if you've got this single generic marketing message,
Yeah.
it's not going to land with everyone.
Right.
Imagine you're like really pushing your enterprise-grade security features,
Yeah.
talking about compliance certifications.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that's really important to, like, a big media company.
Right.
But an SMB owner,
Yeah.
they probably don't care.
Probably not top of mind.
They're more worried about, like, is this affordable?
Right.
Can my team learn it quickly?
Mm-hmm.
Can we get up and running in, like, a few hours, not months?
Makes sense. And on the flip side, if all you're talking about is simplicity, low price, fast onboarding,
Yeah.
some CTO at a big media company might be like, wait a minute, is this thing really going to be able to handle what we need?
Right.
Is it scalable enough?
Exactly. So you got to tailor it. Right.
Exactly.
Tailor your language.
Yeah.
Tailor your value propositions.
Right.
Tailor even your pricing models to fit each specific group.
So you're really speaking their language, addressing their specific concerns?
Exactly. And the article lays out this, like, really practical framework for doing that.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah, they call it the 5 pillars of multi-segment SaaS.
The 5 pillars, okay.
Yeah.
Sounds intriguing.
And these are the areas where you really have to have a nuanced approach.
Okay, so what are those 5 pillars?
So the 5 pillars are market intelligence, product positioning, pricing strategy, sales and marketing alignment, and customer success.
Okay, so 5 key areas where you need to be thinking about different segments differently.
Exactly.
So let's break those down a little bit. Starting with market intelligence. How would you approach gathering information differently if you're targeting an enterprise versus an SMB?
Well, for enterprise, you really have to understand their organizational hierarchies,
Right.
which can be crazy complicated. You have to figure out like who all the decision makers are.
Multiple people involved, often in different departments.
Yeah, and you might even have to like navigate some internal politics.
Can't forget about the politics.
Yeah. But with SMBs, it's a bit different.
Okay.
You might be looking at like online communities,
Yes.
seeing where they're getting their recommendations, tracking word of mouth referrals,
Right.
looking at how effective your free trials are,
Interesting.
and how your self-service onboarding is working.
So it's really about understanding how they find information, who they trust.
Totally.
Makes sense. Now, what about product positioning? How do you talk about your product in a way that resonates with both groups?
So if you're talking to a big media enterprise, you might really play up those advanced reporting features.
Yeah.
Talk about how they can get these like really deep insights into how people are consuming their content. You might mention that they'll have like a dedicated account manager.
Right. Somebody who really understands their business.
Exactly. And then you'd also want to like really reassure them about your compliance and security protocol.
Especially in media.
Yeah.
Ah.
They want to know that their content's protected.
Of course.
But if you're talking to a smaller creator, maybe a filmmaker or a podcaster,
Yeah.
you'd probably focus on like, this is going to save you money.
Right.
This is easy to use. You're going to see results fast.
So a different emphasis.
Very different.
Okay. And then there's pricing strategy.
Right.
How does that differ between enterprise and SMB?
So enterprise, they're often okay with like a longer implementation.
Okay.
And maybe a more complex pricing structure.
Yeah.
As long as they're getting like a really robust feature set and they can see that long-term ROI.
Right. They're looking at the big picture.
Yeah. And they're used to those like lengthy vetting processes.
Yeah.
And, things like account-based marketing.
Right.
But SMBs, they want things simple.
Okay.
They like subscriptions.
Yeah.
They want predictable costs.
Makes sense.
They want to start small, see results quick, and then maybe scale up if they need to.
Right. No huge upfront investments.
No,
Okay.
they're not really into that.
And how does all of this impact the way you approach sales and marketing?
So everything's got to be tailored.
Right.
Your sales cycle, the channels you use, the content you create, it all has to match how each segment actually buys things.
So, for example, a white paper that dives deep into ROI might be great for enterprise.
Yeah.
But for an SMB, maybe a short video showing how easy the product is to use would be more effective.
Exactly. You got to speak their language.
Totally. And then finally, there's customer success.
Yeah.
How do you support those different segments?
So enterprise clients, they often need like a lot of support.
Okay.
Very dedicated support.
Right.
They might need help with integrations.
Yeah.
They might need training for large teams.
Mm-hmm.
They often want like advanced reporting.
Right. To really understand how they're using the product.
Yeah. They expect a lot of hand-holding.
Okay. So a very high-touch approach.
Very much so.
Ah.
But SMBs, they often prefer self-service stuff.
Okay.
They want knowledge bases.
Right.
They want online chat support.
Got it.
They just want quick answers.
Yeah.
Easy to understand. They don't necessarily want someone, like, checking in on them all the time.
Makes sense.
So it's a very different approach.
So we've covered the 5 pillars, and now the article kind of circles back to this central idea,
Right.
this SaaS paradox.
Right.
What's the key takeaway there?
It's that, when you're trying to get everyone to use your product, you might actually be watering down your message.
Diluting your value proposition.
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to appeal to so many different people that you end up not really speaking to anyone specifically.
And that can actually hinder your growth.
Yeah, because, real growth comes from understanding your audience really deeply.
Right.
And then using very targeted tactics to reach them.
So it's about quality over quantity.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the article also talks about why this is especially important for leaders in specific industries.
It does.
And it mentions media and entertainment.
Right.
So can you talk about why this paradox matters so much in those worlds?
Yeah. So, think about the media landscape. You've got these huge global conglomerates.
Yeah.
Right? Managing massive content libraries.
Right.
Dealing with crazy complicated rights and licensing agreements.
Lots of moving parts.
Yeah. And then you've got, like, your independent filmmaker.
Yeah.
Maybe working on a shoestring budget. Or your podcaster trying to find an easy way to, like, host and monetize their content.
Totally different need.
Completely different.
So you can't use the same playbook for both.
No, you got to have different strategies, different go-to-market approaches, each one tailored to those specific pain points, their budget, how they adopt new technologies.
So instead of one message for everyone, you need to be thinking about crafting different messages for different audiences.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get specific. How would your message differ when you're talking to a big media company versus an independent creator?
Okay, so for the big media company, you'd probably focus on things like compliance with digital rights management. You know how secure your platform is.
Right.
Making sure their content is safe from piracy. And then, maybe highlighting your advanced analytics capabilities.
So they can really understand their audience.
Exactly. But for the independent creator, you're probably talking about affordability.
Right.
How easy your tools are to use.
Yeah.
And how quickly they can start making money from their content.
So a much more immediate focus.
Yeah.
Okay. The article also talks about the importance of data in all of this.
It does.
So how does data help you navigate these different segments?
Data is essential.
Yeah.
By tracking things like customer acquisition costs, looking at how each segment's using your features, looking at engagement, churn rates.
Yeah.
You can get some really valuable insights.
Right.
So you can adjust your products, your marketing.
Right.
Make them more targeted.
So, for example, you can see which features are resonating with different groups, and then use that information to decide what to focus your development efforts on.
Exactly. And you can see where you're getting the best return on your investment.
Yeah.
Whether it's marketing or product development.
So it helps you be more strategic and efficient with your resources.
Absolutely.
Now, are there any downsides to this multi-segment approach?
Yeah, there are some things to watch out for.
Okay.
One is strategic drift.
What's that?
So, if you've got all these different initiatives going on,
Yeah.
focused on different segments, you have to make sure they're all aligned with, like, your overall company vision.
Right. You don't want them to go off in different directions.
Exactly. And then, you can also run the risk of overstretching your teams.
Yeah.
If they're trying to manage all these different things at the same time.
Multiple campaigns, multiple sales processes.
Exactly.
It can get complicated.
It can. And so communication is really important.
Right.
You got to make sure everyone's talking to each other. So you don't end up with, like, these silos.
Right.
And you keep that consistent brand experience for all your customers.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then, your marketing tactics have to be adapted too.
Okay.
So something that works for an SMB owner
Yeah.
might not work for, like, an executive at a big media company.
Totally different audiences.
Yeah. So you have to be really thoughtful about how you're communicating with each group.
And the article mentions Ungulum as a resource for companies that are trying to do all of this.
It does, yeah.
So tell me about Ungulum and how they can help.
So Ungulum has, like, a ton of expertise in revenue growth management.
Okay.
They do consulting.
Yeah.
They even do fractional sales leadership.
Interesting.
So they can really help you, analyze your market position, dig into your customer data, figure out who your key segments are.
Yeah.
And then they can help you design those tailored strategies for each segment.
So they can help you create those different maps. And not just identify the segments, but actually figure out how to approach them.
Yeah, and they can even help you with implementation.
Okay.
Like setting the right pricing, making sure your marketing campaigns are aligned.
So they're really hands-on.
Very much so.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the big question to ask yourself is, am I using a single map?
Yeah.
Trying to navigate every possible customer? Or do I have a set of specialized charts?
Right.
And the right people to read those charts?
For each segment.
Yeah. Because sometimes trying to be everything to everyone can keep you from reaching your full potential.
And missing out on those really valuable, specific opportunities.
Exactly. It might feel safe to stick with that one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
But in the long run, you're probably leaving money on the table.
Missing out on customers who are looking for exactly what you have to offer.
Yeah. So the key is to master that multi-segment landscape. Use your data, allocate your resources strategically, and really tailor your tactics to each audience.
It might mean changing things up a bit.
It might.
But it's likely to lead to much stronger, more sustainable growth over time.
Absolutely. And it's about building real relationships with your customers.
Yeah.
Really understanding their needs, their priorities.
Right.
And being open to, maybe some surprising insights about what drives their decisions.
So don't be afraid to dig deep and really understand your customer.
Exactly. So as you're thinking about your own business, think about how you could apply these principles.
Yeah.
Figure out how to capture those specific segments.
Right.
Instead of just trying to vaguely serve everyone.
It's about finding the right fit.
Exactly.
So chart your course carefully.
Absolutely.
And focus on the customers that matter most.
Great advice. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the SaaS Paradox for this week.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like and subscribe to Success Beyond Borders.
We'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.